Welcome to Maxwell Institute Conversations, special videocast episodes of the Maxwell Institute podcast, hosted by Terryl Givens and created in collaboration with Faith Matters Foundation. You can watch this episode in your podcast app, or if you're on the run, listen to the audio version. Does God ever get surprised? Brian Kershisnik is a Latter-day Saint and an American painter who suggests that the answer is yes. Latter-day Saints believe in a God who can be surprised, who can be delighted by the creativity we express. Kershisnik describes painting as a method of discovery and inspiration. So, like God, an artist can be surprised by her own work.
Part of making things is you have an idea, you have a plan, but part of the process is letting what happens show you stuff and teach you stuff and show you something from a new angle that is a delight. And I use the same word, a surprise.
This episode is more visual than usual, with examples of Kershisnik's art, so audio listeners might want to check out the video on YouTube. It's Brian Kershisnik talking with Terryl Givens in this episode of Maxwell Institute Conversations.
Hello and welcome to another conversation. My name is Terryl Givens and my guest today is Brian Kershisnik, one of my good friends and one of the great Mormon artists of our day. Truly happy to have you with us today, Brian.
Thank you, Terryl. I'm a little startled at that introduction, but I hope that's true.
It is. I think it is true. And we're going to be talking a good deal about your art. We're going to be looking at some specific examples of your work. But we want to start off by getting to know you a little bit better. Some in our audience might not be familiar with you as a person as well as an artist. And so let's start with a cheerful question like, what might your obituary look like? If you had to just imagine a couple of things that would be on it. If you were to end your mortal life at this point, what would it say?
I think that it would... I hope that it indicates that I died in the middle of a lot of good projects, and I aspire to unfinished business, I suppose. There are many things I want to sum up, but I hope that all the way through that I'm engaged with things that I care about and that are troubling me and that are stretching me. And I aspire actually more to being, I hope that I'm to be a good human being rather than an artist. Obviously, you're talking to me here because of my profession, but I derive a lot of power, I think, in my art from a search to deepen myself as a human. I hope that shows up in my obituary. I think, talking to a friend recently, I considered for the first time that I should maybe write it.
Well, give us a quick overview of your life up to now.
Just biography.
Yeah, biography.
My father was a petroleum geologist. Both my parents were born in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and part of the agreement when they married was that they were going to leave Rock Springs. They wanted to get out and see the world. My father was in a vocation that allowed for that. Their first assignment was in Sicily, and that was before I was born. I'm the youngest of four boys. When I was born, they were living in Oklahoma City, but just very briefly, I have no memories of Oklahoma. I left, I think, when I was 1. But at 5 years old, we moved to Portuguese West Africa, to Angola. And I have some memories before that, but that's where I start kind of remembering the chronology
right.
And the narrative. That was very exciting, and my parents loved adventurous overseas assignments, and so it didn't occur to us children to not love them too. When I was 8, we moved to Bangkok, Thailand. I was baptized in a swimming pool in Bangkok.
Your parents were LDS?
Yes, my father actually was not until I was about 14. I was baptized by my older brother. My father was not a member at that point. My mother actually became a Catholic to marry my father. Her situation growing up was complicated and difficult, and she was raised. Her mother had raised her as a Latter-day Saint, but had died when my mother was 8. And things got a bit complicated. In the end, Mom, having become a Catholic to marry my father, missionaries knocked on her door, and she burst into tears, and they didn't know if they had a lunatic or a golden contact. But anyway, she decided she needed to come back and to raise her children as Mormons. My father was not interested at the time in joining, but thought, well, they should go to church together. So for my youth, he always came.
Yeah.
But joined then when I was 14. And so that was in Texas. So after Thailand, we moved to Texas. And then for my senior year in high school, we moved to Islamabad, Pakistan. And I was there during the Iran crisis, and there were some disturbances in Islamabad where the embassy was burned. And
not a typical American teenage youth.
No, I was graduated early because of the attack to our school. We were evacuated, and so I found myself done with high school in November of my senior year. My brother was at the University of Utah, so I went to Salt Lake and started school
at the U.
There, at the U, yeah, with no notion of what I wanted to pursue as a vocation. I was a curious kid and interested in a lot of things and good at things, but it didn't occur to me what I would do for a livelihood.
So what did you end up majoring in?
I started out thinking I wanted to pursue architecture, and so I took just a general education class in architecture from Peter Goss at the U, and thought that's what I want to do. And so I. At the time, they had no undergraduate degree in architecture. So I was taking some art classes and enjoying them. And I thought, well, I'll just get an undergraduate degree in art and then a graduate degree in architecture. Turned 19, went on a mission to Denmark, decided when I came back I would divide my degree. So I went to BYU for my undergraduate degree in art, and then determined I would then go to the U for architecture, but got derailed fairly quickly as I pursued my art studies. It became apparent that there was something in there that was trying to get out, and so I initially assumed that I would teach. All of my role models were instructors. I had not grown up knowing artists or ever having been in a studio, and so I assumed that I too would become a professor, but in the process just became tangled up in the process of making paintings and such.
You know, you said a minute ago that I'm having you on as a guest because of your professional status and qualifications. That's not strictly speaking true.
Okay.
Because in all of my interactions with you, I see you as a holistic individual, and art is one part of that. But it seems to me that it's integrated into a life in a very thoroughgoing way, and I would find it hard to separate out what you do professionally from who you are.
I appreciate that, because I very much try my discipleship, what I do in the studio, what happens at home. I try as much as possible to
integrate those,
tie those together, and have those different things feed each other. My friendships are hugely important to me in the development of all of those other facets.
Right.
And so I appreciate that, and I think that there are things that are interesting about my work that emerge very much from my life, from my relationships with my friends and my family and my children.
Yeah. I mean, it's commonly observed of Latter-day Saints, right, that we are something more than a denomination. And sociologists struggle with this, right? Are we a global tribe? Are we an ethnicity? Are we a subculture? And there's a sense that something about Mormon activity and engagement in the church is all pervasive. But that's not, to me, the interesting thing that explains the Mormon identity. I think it has more to do with a theology that is all-encompassing.
Yeah.
And you can't segregate our religious beliefs from our kind of daily engagement, what it means to be human or a father or a child or anything else.
Without imperiling them.
Yeah.
You can, and people do.
Right.
But it messes things up. And obviously I would by no means maintain that I am wonderfully consistent in all those things. I aspire to do that. I aspire to integrate those things. But frankly, going to work is work. It is sweat. It is labor. It is a difficulty. But it is those things very much like discipleship is. Discipleship is not always the conduit to the heavens opening up. There's a huge amount of it that is working through current difficulties or current good and bad things.
We're going to see that in some of your work.
Yeah,
in just a few minutes.
I hope so. And the but painting is very much like that too. And I think that in some ways people have a sense of in examining a religion that they want they just want all the good parts and I love it that in several sections in the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord is saying to various people, cast your mind back to when I spoke peace to your, I'm paraphrasing, but when I spoke
Section
peace to your
6,
mind. And I think that there's a huge amount of our lives where we need to do that we don't live constantly in this, in feeling that presence. We have it, we remember it, we look forward to it, and we sort things out in between.
Yeah.
So anyway, that is actually a good description of what happens in the studio too. I think people have a notion that you go into the studio and the heavens open and you then execute something. And a lot of it is very much like cleaning out the stables, or I think there's a Van Gogh quote that I haven't been able to find where he says it's really more like coal mining than anything else. I come from a long line of coal miners actually, so maybe that's why I ended up in art.
Okay, let me ask you this question. I generally reference William Wordsworth and some of his words that I love when he refers to the fact that there are in our existence spots of time. And he goes on to say that there are these moments that have this power, this transformative kind of catalyzing influence in our lives that give new direction or shape to who we are, spiritually, professionally, emotionally. Can you think of 2 or 3 moments in your life that just stand out where a window opened to new possibilities?
Yeah, I remember, actually, one that comes to mind was as a missionary. And I had read the scriptures. I was a dutiful seminary student, and I had read the scriptures and loved them, I would say, and had a testimony of them. But on my mission was diving into them differently. Yeah. And I remember this one experience in reading in the book of Ether. And I have, of course, my missionary scriptures, and they're all marked up, and most of the things I don't now know why that was interesting to me at the time. But I remember this kind of remarkable revelatory experience reading in Ether 12. And it's a scripture we quote all the time about. We actually, it is often quoted as weaknesses becoming strengths, but that's not what the scripture says. And I remember kind of feeling like I'm having this conversation, or I'm present somehow with Moroni as he's lamenting to God about the weakness of what he's writing, and he says, "Oh, the Gentiles are going to laugh at this, and because of this, we stumble because of the placing of our words." And he says, "You make us that when we speak, we can speak by the Spirit, but when we write, it's a problem." And I was very much with Moroni and saying, no, you're doing great. This is wonderful. And God answers Moroni in that chapter by essentially saying, yeah, ouch. But fools mock, but they'll mourn. And if they'll acknowledge their weakness, then they won't take advantage of your weakness. He essentially says to Moroni, yeah, there are problems with it. But if they acknowledge their weaknesses, then weak things, I would maintain this book will become strong unto them.
Yeah.
And just when I realized that and realized that becoming an active and important participant in the world does not require that it can happen without my having to become this perfect thing.
Yeah.
That if we engage together as humans in a way that where we acknowledge our own weaknesses, then we can become strong to each other. Then I mean, the Book of Mormon, which I hold to be scripture, and there are problems with it, but that's okay. Moroni acknowledges that, and
it sounds to me like you're making an important distinction, which I would make too, between weaknesses and weakness. In other words, do you think that part of what is being described here is a generalized condition of inadequacy? I think sometimes we think that, oh, God gives me a tendency toward alcoholism, or He gives me this right tendency towards moral flaws or failings. And I get the sense, no, what God is saying is that you are constructed in such a way. I put you into a moral context and an embodiment such that you're inadequate. And now what do you do from there? Because I will sanctify you in spite of those things, not contingent upon some kind of perfection that you achieve.
Yeah, I one thing I find often in conversations about God is the doctrine that He created us is often discussed like He built us from a kit.
Yeah.
Rather than something more like a father. That like you say, a tendency to chew my fingernails was not a piece placed in there to see what I would do with it, but I am in a condition, and also in this fallen world in a broken condition, and so it is important in that circumstance for me to the way to maintain the appropriate amount of humility is to acknowledge that myself and be careful about the demands I make on the people around me. I mean, I feel like Jesus' injunction to judge not, that you be not judged, is essentially Him saying, don't judge because you have no idea, that not that judgment is bad, but just you got to be really careful about making determinations because you're really operating in a very limited circumstance.
So this insight that you come to at the age of 20 or so in your mission about the inadequacy of ourselves, our failings, and the messiness of the human condition. Yeah. Is that part of what you think is pervading your art, is one of your themes?
Yeah, I think so. One thing that I feel like began to be introduced at that instant is because of our love and affection for truth and for God and for the gospel, we tend to try to imagine that they're a little cleaner than they actually are. And that leads to some difficulties.
Yeah.
And to kind of acknowledge that, no, we're working in a circumstance that is broken in many ways, that we are being redeemed from a broken circumstance, and we should do our best. We should do our best, and we are weak. Yeah. We behave in weakness, and so I need to be careful in including that in pictures. But the way it shows up is that I want to paint people that are very human.
Yeah.
When I paint dancers, these are heavy-footed dads. These are not trained
Degas ballerinas.
Yeah, that's right. And I love his work, but I'm kind of looking at a different thing. But even Degas, in those paintings, would often paint them backstage, paint them when they're not being picturesque, when they're scratching their backs and such. I think that those actually were very influential in my dancer paintings.
Yeah, I want to go off on a tangent here for a moment, because you've used the word brokenness 4 or 5 times. And of course, Fiona and I have spoken a lot recently in our work about 1 Nephi 13, the original translation.
Yeah, I love that insight.
In which we're wounded. There's this woundedness. And you haven't used the word sin when you talk about brokenness or when you talk about weakness, which I think is important. I think sin is real. There is sin.
Certainly.
But I think the reality in which we are immersed is not a primal condition of sinfulness as much as it's an earthly condition of brokenness.
Yeah.
And I was reading a new translation of the New Testament recently, and Luke 4, where Christ announces himself in the synagogue, which I think is a crucial scripture, because that is how Christ presents himself. This is who I am. You want to know who I am? Here are the words of Isaiah. And the way that this is more fully rendered, I think, in a better rendering of the Greek, he says, I'm come to liberate those who are broken by calamity. And it's that phrase, broken by calamity, that really speaks to me. And I think this might be a good time to refer.
How is it in King James? Bind up the wound.
Bind up the wounded, something about the brokenhearted, and liberate the captives. But this might be a good time to refer to one of your paintings, which is one of my favorites, it's one of a series, I think. Is this right? Jesus and the Angry Babies?
Yes.
Do I have that right?
That's right.
And I think we have a visual that we can show here for those who are watching. But I can see it here in the studio. And I don't know how you can look at this painting without just erupting in a delightful kind of laughter. Part of it is because of
a slightly irreverent laughter.
Slightly irreverent, but it's an appreciative laughter. There's nothing mocking about it, but there's this kind of look of consternation on the face of the Christ as he holds babies who are fussy and upset. And so one thing I love about your art is that there's a whimsical quality to it, but there's a deep profundity that underlies that whimsy. Can you talk a little bit about this painting and how it speaks to you?
Well, initially, I have a good friend that I play music with, Steve Vistana, and we draw. He is he's a graphics designer, he's an artist, and we draw together just in our sketchbooks. I always have my sketchbook handy, and just because we'll talk about this a little bit later, but most ideas are bad, and so a sketchbook is a way to kind of make a note and then decide later if it's useful or not. So in one of my sketchbooks like this, I just to entertain Steve, I making a bit of a pun on all of the paintings of Jesus with the cherubic, well-behaved children on his lap. I drew him. It's just a little tiny thing with these irate.
Painted by people who've never worked in an LDS nursery, obviously.
Well, and I mean, initially we just laughed. Because we thought it was funny. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I believe that Jesus took the children on his lap. And I know children, and they weren't all happy about it,
Yeah.
I mean, for some of them, it was mom's idea, and it felt to me like a much better metaphor for my experience with discipleship and with other people to put a lap full of fairly unruly babies on Jesus' lap, that he continues to deal with us, he continues to work with us, he continues to remember us, even though we are, for the most part, not well behaved.
Yeah.
And I don't. I mean, I know children, and I know that they weren't all picturesque instances.
So you're kind of de-idealizing the sacred in some ways.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to warm it up a little bit. There's a certain kind of laughter. I mentioned that when you talked about the humor in this painting, and I use the word irreverent. There's a certain kind of delight and humor that happens because of a certain irreverence that children introduce into our lives, and certainly in our discipleship. I mean, I remember, little inappropriate things being yelled out during the passing of the sacrament or something like that. That having children it brings a certain unruliness to our existence.
Yeah.
And I think it's healthy as disciples to think of ourselves in relation to Jesus as children. I mean, as you have mentioned, we are of a species. We are related to him. He Heavenly Father is referred to as our Father because he's our Father. He's an ancestor. And so I like to. When I paint Jesus, I certainly have no intention at all of being disrespectful to the Lord, but I like to remind us of the warmth of the fact that he came into one of these. He became one of us. Even though in pictures and literature we make it so everything happened almost according to some divine script. I think that I believe in a Jesus who was surprised by events and who reacted to events and who became annoyed at his disciples because they didn't understand. And and I feel like it's important to include that.
See, I think I would characterize what you're doing maybe a little bit differently. I think that what you are doing is you are reinscribing a new definition of the sacred. Is what I would say.
Okay, I like that.
And here's what I mean
to
by that.
To include some other things.
Exactly. Phil Barlow, who I have to have on sometime just to talk about this one idea, but he said to me something that caught me up short. He said, "Don't you think at times that we err in making Christ or the atonement into idols?" Mm. And I thought, well, how can you make that which is the most sacred into? Right. But I think this is in part what he means is that to strip something of all of its rough edges isn't to sacralize it, right? It's to denude it of that which makes it real and sacred. And I'm thinking, for example, of John chapter 8, that moment where, right, the woman is caught in adultery. And Jesus says, well, if you're without sin, go ahead and cast the first stone. Then he kneels down and he writes in the sand. And you've got centuries of commentators saying, "Oh, he was probably writing some profound, it was cryptic, but there was something really profound and godly in this message." And I think he was doodling in the sand. Yeah. Right? That's a human thing to do. You just kind of, while you're waiting for people to make up their minds what they're going to do. But we don't want to see that. That's too human. That's too real.
It sounds like, from the text, that he is distracted by what he's doing. He stands up and, "Oh, woman, where are thine accusers?" It does not sound like he continues to engage them with mysterious things on the ground. Again, I'm supposing, just like these people for centuries have been supposing, but I am comfortable with the fact that it may have been just drawing something.
So I'll give a name to what you're doing here. I will call it desanitizing the sacred.
Well, I feel like the advantage to that, if people can not be offended by it, is that when we tend to scrub the sacred in the past, and I feel like it robs us of experiences of the sacred in the present, because our current sacred experiences also have messy elements. And I think that sometimes we tend to diminish them because that's not what happened. That's not what happened to Joseph, or that's not what happened to Jesus, or that's not what happened to Moses. Yeah. And I think it is what happened to Joseph and Jesus and Moses. I think their experiences, someone walking by in Jerusalem would not have known that it was Jesus because he was glowing and beautiful and perfectly kept.
And doesn't this same tendency come back to bite us when it comes to how we idealize our own prophetic legacy? And I'm thinking, for example, of Bushman's book, Rough Stone Rolling, and the various responses to that book. And I was with him at one fireside where somebody said, "Thank you for writing that book because it helped me leave the church." And, of course, it's the kind of thing that Richard obviously hates to hear. Yeah. But then you have the response of my son, who at the time was on a mission, who went through a very unorthodox, unensign-like trajectory in his own life. And he wrote me from his mission, and he said, I read Rough Stone Rolling, and it was the most inspiring thing I've ever read. Because I thought, if God can work with that, then he can work with me.
That's the miracle that I think is indicated in Ether 12.
Yeah.
And I think that I think you're right that we do these great people a disservice by carving them in marble and not allowing them errors or not allowing them flaws in any way. I think that we then kind of suppose that we ourselves are somehow excluded from participation in certain sacred events because we certainly know we're not perfect.
Right.
And I love that, because actually the children being unruly on Jesus' lap is not unsacred. I hope it's not unsacred, because most of my experiences with Jesus involve a degree of my own unruliness, but the sense of his persistence in reaching. I think it's a really healthy way to look at it, that he is someone who is reaching to heal wounds, many of which we did not inflict. Now, we've exaggerated them, and we haven't taken care of them, and we make a lot of messes for ourselves, but we're in a circumstance that warrants a great deal of grace. Probably not, maybe not as much grace as he continues to extend. I think the part of the miracle is that I think where maybe I have no knowledge of this kind of interaction, but where the universe might be looking at this fallen world and say, cut that one loose and start again, and I think the miracle is that no, he continues. Yeah. He continues to work, even though Lucifer continues to work as if he's acting like someone who feels like he can succeed, and God continues to push the cause forward, and with the work for the dead and missionary work, that these things continue to push forward, show, and it's astonishingly courageous, brave, inventive, creative deity who amazingly cares about me, and us and you.
Yeah. Well, let's segue from that picture then to one that I think in some ways is influenced by the same sensibility, which is the descent from the cross, which is not whimsical, but it also in some ways desanitizes the sacred in the same way. So if we could look at that picture now. The descent from the cross, of course, is a well-established theme in religious art that goes back many, many centuries, and I think some of the greatest religious art ever done is on that theme. Yours breaks in many ways with the tradition and introduces some novel dimensions and perspectives. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Well, of course, I couldn't address a subject like that without being very much aware of Caravaggio and Rubens and Rembrandt, and trying to go to a subject like that without being intimidated by the burden of the other great artists dealing with it. But we've talked now about two paintings that both have Jesus in them, which describes a very small percentage of my total output. I feel like my work is religious, even though it seldom illustrates something from the scriptures. But these two, of course, do. Jesus with children and the descent from the cross. The having painted that large monumental nativity painting, it's 18 feet long or something like that. I mean, it's big. That painting was the first monumental, what I call a sacred subject, when it's something from the scriptures or from sacred history. And so the first time I tried a monumental sacred subject, it worked surprisingly well. I mean, I was surprised.
Is that
myself.
in the Springville Museum? Is that where?
No, that's at BYU. They own it. It was purchased and donated to BYU Museum. Okay. That painting is generally looked at as being so optimistic. Certainly, birth is a time full of promise and optimism and such. I feel like nativity is a little more complicated than that, than just giddy delight and optimism.
Especially if you consider the cost of the babes of Bethlehem.
Yeah, well, and I for example, there are some of the angels in that painting that are crying, and people say, oh, they're crying for joy, and I say, they know the stature of the being that is now compressed into this little purple, hungry, uncoordinated human. The miracle of the nativity.
Condescension.
The condescension is that he came into our dirt and our milk and our blood and our sweat, and he came here. He came, and I feel like that would be in the moment, even if it was our only chance, it would still be kind of upsetting for the angels who knew the contrast. Are we sure this is a good idea? And so it was years before I tried another monumental sacred subject. And I wanted to go to the other end of the story. And so I chose the dead Christ. And because I feel like when we read the story at the conclusion of the Gospels, that you and I know how it's going to end. We've read it before. We've heard it before. We know what's going to happen in a few days.
Right.
And of course, Jesus had prophesied to them too what was going to happen in a few days. But this had never happened, and they were not thinking about that. They were, as they were taking down his dead body, which is also a little peculiar to me, that the Romans would have allowed that to happen. I think that's kind of a beautiful thing, that they let the family deal with the body, because of course the Romans would have just been in a hurry and bones breaking and such as they, take the corpses down, that they let his family do it. And so as I painted it, I'm thinking about the difficulty, just the work involved of dealing with the corpse of their fallen hero. And for them at that moment, they can't, I imagine they can't perceive how this can end well, how this can be resolved, how this can be included in what they thought was the redemption they were looking for through this Christ. And so we read, as I painted it, I kept on saying, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, but they don't know that. And I thought, we rob Jesus of an amazing amount of courage and creativity and brilliance in his fulfillment of that sacrifice, because we know that it succeeded. And I don't read Jesus in the garden pleading with the Father that if this cup can pass. I don't read somebody who just knows exactly what's happening. He's just got to go through the motions. I see someone who is advancing with unspeakable courge in the midst
in front of a very real abyss.
A real abyss that is upsetting to him, And so I feel like in some ways, the good news of the resurrection doesn't mean anything unless it emerges from his death, and they are in the midst of that, and we spend more time in our lives in the midst of a problem that we don't know how it could be resolved than we do giddy about the resolution.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go right to the point of the death.
C.S. Lewis says something I think really pertinent in this regard in one of his books where he's talking about the fall. And he says, God can make use of all that happens, but the loss is real.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that knowing that Jesus succeeded in the atonement, we cast it in this kind of, I think that the way I try to describe it is imprecise. I'm limited to human language, and I'm trying to examine a cosmic thing from a human perspective. But I think we must not take out of it completely the amount of risk that was being undertaken on our behalf.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've described that accurately or with the right words.
So you see not just the apostles who are grieving and mourning, as one might expect, but the angels themselves are shattered.
Yeah, some people in looking at this painting, and I don't make ultimate decisions about who knows what, even in my own pictures, but they'll say, why aren't the angels rejoicing? And I don't know that the angels knew how this was going to work out either. I am confident that the Father and the Son were on it, but that it wasn't broadcast, or else his enemies would know and would counter. I think Lucifer killed him thinking he could take him out of the game, thinking that he could do this and that would prevent him from accomplishing what he needed to do. And I think that the Father and the Son saying, we will apply these cosmic precedents, legal precedents, and these things, and that final act of murder will actually complete the atonement part of his mission. And well,
it's magnificent work.
Well, I appreciate that.
It truly is. Angels. I want to talk about angels. They figure so prominently in so much of your work. And I have one delightful rendering here, which is called...
Sometimes It's Hard to Be Dead.
And can you read the...
Yeah. Well, this image came from another sketchbook drawing when I was doing research in Slovenia with my mother for family history research. And this deceased spirit here is saying, "I love you and appreciate what you are doing, but you are often very stupid and it aggravates the crud out of me." And so this researcher down here. And my sense of our interactions with otherworldly beings is also something that I, in my work, try to unscrub a little bit.
Okay. Can I set this up a little bit?
Make it a little more human, a little more of a human interaction.
I just want to give a little of historical context here to highlight, I think, what is really significant about what you're doing here. It strikes me as terribly significant from a Mormon perspective if we realize that the very, very first thing that the Protestants did to the Book of Common Prayer was to strip from the Book of Common Prayer all references to the dead, all prayers to the dead, prayers that were said for the dead. Because one of Luther's principal preoccupations was that we need to sunder the connection between the living and the dead, right? Once you pass the veil of death, that's done. You're done and we're done with you, effectively. Our preoccupation is only with ourselves and with the living. And so, in some ways, contrary to this Mormon myth that the Reformation was a kind of grand prelude to the Restoration is first and foremost redressing what the Reformation had done, which was, right, to sunder these into two completely discontinuous realms. And, one question that I think, some of us should be asking is, other than the obvious talent manifest in your work, why is it so popular in Mormonism today, right? And I'm thinking especially probably your most popular one, "She Shall Find That Which Is Lost." Is that the right?
Yeah. I actually start to forget. I call it "She Will Find What Is Lost," but I think that which is might be in there too.
"She Will Find What Is Lost." My wife has a copy. She has a print of that in her study, which is, again, a heavenly host, assorted angelic beings, right, hovering over a woman. So my sense is that part of what you are doing is celebrating what I think is, in many ways, one of the greatest miracles of the Restoration, which is to say, no, we're still connected.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that and how you've experienced that in your personal work?
Yeah, I have. When you asked me the question initially about my obituary, I was going to say then that I think a lot about death and about the dead. I have not to the point where I've written my own obituary, but I collect death masks. I feel a connection to my ancestors, particularly ones that I have sought out. What's interesting to me is in doing the research, there are certain individuals that are doing the counterpart to that research on the other side. I mean, I think everyone is interested, perhaps, I hope, but Brian Kershisnik and Leonard Derling, I mean, their names, they just appear differently on the page, and they are doing something on that side as we are doing something on this side, that I don't know what it is. I think our understanding of what happens on the other side of the veil is very limited, and we fill in a lot of blanks. But I do feel very much that the witnessing of the events in our lives and the influencing of the events in our lives by otherworldly beings is almost constant, and they're not all. They're not all the good ones. I've also had plenty of experiences where the studio that I neglected to mention in my biography part that I lived in Kanosh for 15 years, and I still have a studio there. And the building that I got was very full of of spirits that needed to go if this was going to be a productive place to work. And what was interesting to me is, the sense that I had is these people. This is where they hang out. They're the kind of dead-ended people. The kind of spirits that I want to interact with don't just hang out in eddies and dark houses. They have stuff to do. These people have nowhere to go. And so as I worked on the building, I would just say, new management, I would just talk out loud while I was driving nails, say, I'm a disciple of Jesus, and anything that happens here, spiritually or physically, is going to be consistent with that. And so if you need to find a new place to be, go. And if you give me trouble, I'll get out my guns. But
See, Brian, this is one reason why I admire you as an individual, really, as well as an artist. One of the greatest, maybe the greatest British scholar of Mormonism said to me one time, he said, Terryl, Mormonism is never really going to achieve its potential and achieve worldwide respect until you learn to mythologize your scriptures, as we have. You've got to be reading the Book of Mormon as allegory. You've got to be taking these sacred texts and turning them into metaphor. And I said, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And I think you represent a kind of spearhead of this resistance to that, of saying, no, we take these things seriously. Yeah. We're not going to make excuses for our belief that God literally spoke to prophets in our age. Yeah. And that these encounters with the divine are not just mental phenomena, they're real. And you celebrate this in your canvases in a way that I think Mormons really rejoice in, and I think that's one reason why you're such a loved artist in our tradition.
I hope so.
And the fact that you can do it both with feeling and also with gentle humor, because certainly not all the dead are happy at what they see us doing, I'm sure.
No, but I believe I also believe in a God who laughs, and I think that just the way we interacting with our children and they do something funny or say something cute, and that's surprising to us. I believe that is a part of God's experience too.
Yeah.
I have the sense, this maybe is, I could be reading this wrong, but I have the sense that in working on things that the spirits and the people who attend me are surprised by what I do. That life is not just a matter of tapping into the ticker tape instruction and execution, that we are obligated, I perceive, by Section 58 and other things, to participate creatively and actively in doing good.
Yeah.
And that there are times when I think I have surprised the people assigned to help me out. And they say, oh, look how he's doing it. Oh, this will work well. Okay, we'll do this.
I wouldn't want to worship a God who couldn't be surprised. I want to feel I can do something that is unexpected.
Well, my tiny little notion of creativity creativity cannot exist without an element of surprise. Now, I choose to read in the scriptures when God says, and he saw that it was good. That is a grand, ancient way of saying
it turned out well.
He really liked it. Yeah. Maybe I'm reading too much between the lines, but those are kind of examples of God saying, have you checked out the fjords? I mean, they are made. Check this out. Who did this? This is great. That part of making things is you have an idea, you have a plan, but part of the process is letting what happens show you stuff and teach you stuff and show you something from a new angle that is a delight. And I use the same word, a surprise. A surprise. Yeah. And the way I think now, I can't imagine an existence in which that stops happening. I can't. It doesn't. I don't believe in an existence where that stops happening.
Well, let's round this out with a couple of final questions. What as a people and as a church do you think we do particularly well?
The friendships that I develop in the process of functioning as a Latter-day Saint are very meaningful. Obviously we get assigned to be home teachers, but sometimes that sets you up to connect profoundly with a human that you might not have ever, that you would not have sought out, that would not have made sense.
Right.
I think that there are affections, close, warm, life-changing affections that I have, connections I have to people, because the structure set that up. And if there was not that structure, then I think it would not have happened.
And what could we do better? Where are we deficient?
I believe that we could be much better at allowing people to participate with us with their troubles and their doubts. I think there's a lot of departure from the church. Some of it might even be necessary. I mean, where people are at such odds. But I think there's too much of it that happens because we, as a people, culturally don't know how to accommodate people who are having trouble with something.
Yeah.
And that is unnaturally and unnecessarily exaggerated. There's a kind of intolerance for trouble that leads to unnecessary conflict.
Yeah, I'd say amen to that.
I actually feel like to be a disciple at any time, in any age, has been to accommodate certain things that don't quite make sense to you. We don't emphasize that that's not what the stories are told about, but that almost in every age there's been an issue or multiple issues that have been hard to carry.
And that's why we have that example, right? I think in the book of John, right, where the disciples hear him teaching about eating his flesh and blood, and they...
Yeah. I love that because they don't say, no, it's no problem. What I hear them say, maybe I'm using too much imagination, although I think imagination is a useful thing in the scriptures, but they are essentially saying, I don't know what you're talking about, but this I know.
Yeah.
And so where would we go?
Where would we
Because
go?
this is.
That's not a powerful affirmation. Where else would we go? Right? I mean, they're saying, well, if there was something better, maybe, but
yeah, that's beautiful. But I think that what's beautiful about that is if we don't scrub it too much, it allows for that very human reality of, yeah, I am part of something where there are some difficulties. I love that I feel like this is changing culturally in the church, and I do hear more voices of people not taking pot shots at policies or anything like that, but acknowledging that I believe I have a testimony, and it's okay if you know that I'm struggling with this.
Right.
I feel like that is more that will allow more people to not feel like they have to stay away if they're having trouble with this or that. Yeah.
Right. Right.
So anyway, I feel like I'm trying to be a part
of that solution.
I'm trying to be. I have a long ways to go myself too.
Yeah. Last question.
Yes.
Holy envy. Do you have holy envy of any other faith, tradition, denomination, culture?
Yeah.
Something you'd really love to see us appropriate and make ours.
Yeah. And this is. I feel like with the restoration, there were so many things that were nebulous and mysterious that became solid for us. God has a body, a flesh and bone. That's a remarkable and amazing revelation. But I think we've erred on the part of simplification, and that when eternal life is to know the Father and Jesus, if that is eternal life, that it's got to be more than knowing that he has a physical body. That there are aspects of unfathomable mystery about godliness that I think we would do well to open ourselves to. And I think that there are aspects of that Buddhists do better and the Catholics do better than we do. And I have been raised all over the world and having mostly being, my friends were Muslims and Catholics and Protestants and such, that there are great aspects of the whole truth that there are some disciplines that
make more room for wonder.
Yeah, I think so. I really think so. I think that this is actually a story that Faith found when we were doing some research on a project of the obviously the 5 blind men and the elephant. You know the story of the 5 blind elephants and the man.
No.
That the 5 blind elephants want to experience man, and so the first one comes up to man and feels him and says, "Man is flat." And so the other 5 elephants come over and they say, "Yeah, he's flat." That we do that to truth a lot of times. We smash it down and flatten it and then make sure everyone agrees, and that there are that.
It took me a minute to get the man is flat.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah. The elephant feels man and he's flattened, and I think that it's okay for me to sit next to you in high priest group and say, his experience of this is different than mine. And that doesn't mean I'm right and he's wrong. That this is a big enough thing that it can have multiple facets, and I would do well, even if I don't agree with every premise you make, that there are things that I have to learn about this larger thing by other angles being taken at it. So anyway.
Right. Well, Brian, thank you for your life as a disciple and as an artist, and keep amusing us and keep provoking us.
Oh, I hope so.
Thank you
very much, Terryl.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us.